Alright, hi. This video will be reading out of a post in a blog. So I'm going to start. The argument that the principal obstacle to the argument that the principal obstacle to the sustainability and growth of human society is its inability to wisely and equitably manage the social, economic, and environmental commons, starting with a re-examination of limits to growth arguments from the 1979s. We acknowledge that the invisible hand of market has been successful in surmounting a great many of the resource limits that people were worried about at the time. The pursuit of self-interest and relatively simple market-based competitive interactions between willing buyers and sellers have been able to maintain a pretty steady flow of the resources that society demands. These resources are, of course, not being equitably distributed. Rather than concluding that society has nothing to worry about, however, we go on to argue that the real limit to growth and the real driver behind the limits to growth, overshoot and collapse scenarios, is society's inability to protect the commons. From a conflict perspective, this is a vastly bigger challenge. It requires getting billions of people to act in mutually supportive ways, even though those actions may be contrary to their short-term self-interest. A big part of the MOOS project will focus on using our knowledge of conflict processes to help strengthen society's common management skills. So here we go. I'll be quoting a transcript from Guy Burgess. Hi, this is Guy Burgess. In this Moving Beyond Intractability seminar post, I'd like to follow up on the argument that I made in an earlier post, that intractable conflict is as serious a threat to human society as climate change. One might understand why this is true if you go back to a book written in the 1970s, The Limits to Growth. The Limits to Growth made an argument that society was facing overshoot and collapse because of two major trends. One is that it argued that society is dependent upon a fixed stock of natural resources, and those resources were rapidly being depleted. As they are depleted, the cost goes up. The drag that the cost of those resources places on industrial output and food production would increase, the book argued, ultimately to the point that it would cause the collapse in the industrial output and food production. Well, that would be the other big driving thing behind the limits to growth scenario was population. Certainly, as population continued to grow, based in large part on the resources that it was depleting, that would place ever more demand on those resources, further compounding things. At any rate, the ultimate dismal prediction was that industrial output, food, and population would ultimately collapse, and that's what folks are trying to figure out how to avoid. This led to books like Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb that basically made the argument that the population of humanity is growing so fast that we're going to run out of resources, space, and collapse. So really, the only alternative was to find ways of reducing population growth. The counter-argument was mounted by a guy named Julian Simon, who argued that humans are the ultimate resource and that we don't really face a natural resource limit. Simon put his faith in Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand of the market that would always create enormous incentives for folks who could produce natural resources less expensively, even in the face of diminishing supplies. They could do this not only from the currently exploited resources, but also find substitute ways of doing the things we want to do with those resources less expensively or by using completely different resources. This led these two guys to make a very famous bet. In 1980, Simon and Ehrlich picked a package of natural resources that they thought was typical of the resource base upon which society depended. And, if I recall correctly, they bet 10 years out about what would happen. Simon bet that the cost of those resources, adjusting for inflation, would actually drop. Elric bet that the prices would go way up because we were running into the resource limits. The truth is that in this case, Simon won and Elric lost. Fast forwarding, in the early 2000s, we thought that we were running into these limits again, this time specifically regarding oil. There were books like The Age of the Tough Oil and Wake Up, This is Peak Oil. They argued that pretty soon we were going to start running out of oil and terrible things were going to happen. But then we invented fracking, and what do you know? We have more oil than we know what to do with, and the world oil price is plummeting. So this suggests a change to the original Club of Rome graph. Instead of having resources collapsing, we may well have, at least when you adjust for substitutions and all that, the prospects for a continuing increase in resources. So then, we might say, hey, there are no limits to growth. There is no overshoot and collapse. The free market fixes all. No need to worry, we're fine. This attitude is reflected in people's willingness to trust in the markets, which is a widespread political phenomenon. A common view illustrating this is that the government needs to just get out of the way, let the markets do their thing, and everything will be all right. Ayn Rand is the poster child for that sort of unlimited market philosophy. But unfortunately, there are some issues here. Certainly, if you remove the resource limit, the industrial output, food, and population are going to continue to grow with no obvious limits in sight. But the problem was that there was another little graph here, the pollution graph, and it goes continuously up. So even if you don't have resource limits or population limits, everything keeps growing, including the pollution burden on the planet. So you run the risk of what is called a concept first introduced by Gary Hardin, which he called the tragedy of the commons. So then you go back to the original Club of Rome graph. You can see that pollution comes up, and then that also starts crashing as output is diminished by exploding pollution. So pollution, not resources, is the real limit to growth. That's what we're trying to find some way to deal with. So in a sense, the real limits to growth is not the ability to produce more resources. Markets take care of that. And one of the other things is important to understand is that markets are very simple organizational processes. They are transactions between willing buyers and willing sellers. It doesn't take any large-scale collaboration agreements for markets to work. It is just cooperation between buyers and sellers. I want something, and you get it to me for cheaper. I'll buy it. Even giant corporations are basically networks of willing buyers and willing sellers. The problem with the tragedy of the commons is that a tragedy arises when lots of willing buyer and seller interactions wind up depleting the commons on which everyone depends. In Garrett Hardin's original formulation, ranchers graze sheep on a commons in the center of a town. The incentive was for everybody to graze more cows on the free commons, but I think he meant sheep. But eventually, all those sheep overgraze the grass, and all the grass and sheep die. This really happened in the American West. If you wonder why there is sagebrush everywhere now, not grass, it is because we overgrazed the American West. There was a big drought. The giant cattle herds of the 1870s collapsed, and sagebrush was the only thing cows wouldn't eat. They would rather die first. So the real challenge, the real limit to growth, is how we avoid tragedies of the commons like this. Now obviously, climate change is just such a tragedy of the commons. There are a bunch of other planetary boundaries that we may be crossing too. The big thing here is that we've got to find ways of addressing all this before we collapse. The other thing to keep in mind is when we're talking about protecting the commons is that there are two philosophical perspectives. One is the hardcore environmental perspective, which may be best exemplified by Earth First, which is a pretty extreme group which, on occasion, has gotten precariously close to advocating and or enacting eco-terrorism. Their motto is no compromise in defense of Mother Earth. They see human society as a cancer growing on the planet. So their idea of protecting the commons is to protect the commons from people. Understandably, many other people don't think that is such a good idea. So you certainly can't build a big coalition behind that. On the other hand, folks like the Human Security Working Group focus on protecting the commons for the people.